Hello. I'd like to talk to you today about one of the most important subjects of the current world, and what we will do is examine it in its ancient setting. We're going to talk about Islam. But before we do that, I want to tell you a story. This is a story about Raed El-Zubi. Here you see him with his wife and my wife and I. He is a former student of mine, and he sent this story to me because he wanted us to understand a little bit more about the Middle East, and I think it's worth telling. A disappointed salesman of a cola company returned from his Middle East assignment. A friend asked, "Why weren't you successful with the Arabs?" The salesman explained, "When I got posted to the Middle East, I was very confident that I would make a good sales pitch, as cola is virtually unknown there. But I had a problem. I didn't speak Arabic, so I planned to convey the message through 3 posters. Poster number 1, a man lying in the hot desert sand, totally exhausted and fainting. Poster number 2, the man is drinking our cola. Poster number 3, our man is totally refreshed." And then these posters were pasted all over the place. "Well, then that should have worked," said the friend. "It should have," said the salesman. "But I didn't realize that Arabs read from right to left." Well, maybe things are backwards sometimes in the Middle East. Backwards for us, right for them. Let's see if we can understand Islam a little bit better. This is a picture of the Great Mosque in Mecca. The black box that you see in the middle of all of those people is called the Kaaba. It is the most holy site in all of Islam. It is the site that is the direction to which all Muslims pray when they pray in their various individual places, or when they go to a mosque to pray. We'll have some more discussion about what is the Kaaba and why it's so special. But a little background first. We've been talking about the Roman Empire, and I think that it's important for us to realize that there are 3 civilizations that succeeded after the Roman Empire. They're really continuations of the Roman Empire with some variations. The first is the Byzantine Empire, or Byzantium, and we've just talked about that in our previous lecture. They retained the title, the government, the way of living as best they could, the culture of Rome, the religion. It was, of course, Christian. So many of the things continued in the Byzantine Empire, and they viewed themselves as the continuation of the Roman Empire. The second is Islam. That may surprise you to think that they are also a continuation of the Roman Empire, but in many ways they are. True, they differed in their religion, but they occupied much of the same space. They had the same thirst for knowledge and growth that the early Roman Empire had, and they were largely an urban culture, which might surprise you because the Arabs themselves were not an urban culture. But later on, as Islam began to dominate major territories, they became more and more urban in their orientation. And finally, Western Europe. That's probably the part that most of us who are dominated by European culture think of as the continuation. But in many ways, it is the least likely to be the continuation, because it was not progressive, and much of the culture of Rome just simply disappeared during what we call the Dark Ages. And we'll talk about that later in another lecture. But certainly for Europe to capture the glory of Rome required a new birth. That new birth was called the Renaissance, and it happened about 800 years after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. Now let's focus our attention on Islam. Here's an introductory video that will tell us some of the things about Islam that will set the foundation for us.
In Cairo, a muezzin calls faithful Muslims to prayer. It's the same call that sounds 5 times a day, every day, in cities across the world. Nearly a quarter of the people on earth respond to it, bound together by the enduring spirit of Islam. God is most great, the muezzin calls. I testify there is no other God but God. I testify Muhammad is the messenger of God. Come and pray. Come and flourish. God is most great. There is no God but God. In the unfolding of history, Islamic civilization has been one of humanity's grandest achievements. A worldwide power founded simply on faith. A spiritual revolution that would shape the nations of 3 continents and launch an empire. For the West, much of the history of Islam has been obscured behind a veil of fear and misunderstanding. Yet Islam's hidden history is deeply and surprisingly interwoven with Western civilization. It was Muslim scholars who reclaimed the ancient wisdom of the Greeks, while Europe languished in the Dark Ages. It was they who sowed the seeds of the Renaissance, 600 years before the birth of Leonardo da Vinci. From the way we heal the sick, to the numerals we use for counting, cultures across the globe have been shaped by Islamic civilization. But all this began with the life of a single, ordinary man, and the profound message he proclaimed would change the world forever. His name was Muhammad.
This young man, Muhammad, was born in the middle part of the 7th century and lived until the 8th century. He was born in Mecca. Mecca was a trading city on the western coast of present-day Saudi Arabia. It was a large city, and it had many caravans that would come into the city carrying spices and food and other supplies, not only to the city of Mecca, but it was on the pathway that we call the frankincense route from southern Arabia up along the western coast into the Mediterranean area. Muhammad was famous for getting along with people. He was well respected. He was a member of one of the large tribes and was the son of a tribal leader. And then his father died when he was a very young boy, perhaps even before he was born. I can't quite remember. And he came under the protection of his uncle, who was the leader of the tribe. And one day, there had been a problem in the Kaaba. Let me explain what the Kaaba was now. Kaaba was a square edifice erected around a very holy stone. Muslims believed that this stone was sent from God, perhaps to Adam, and then was given to Abraham as a place for worship. And it may have been part of an altar that was used by those 2 great prophets. but the stone had rolled off its pedestal during an earthquake. And the tribes were arguing amongst themselves to decide who would have the right to put the stone back on the pedestal. What tribe would be given this great honor? And the four principal tribes were in the cabal arguing, and finally they said, well, let's let the next person who comes in decide. And the next person to come in was young Muhammad. He looked at the situation and he suggested that they lay a cloth on the ground. And they put the stone in the middle of the cloth, and then each of the tribes would take a corner, and together they would lift it onto its pedestal. Well, they were all overjoyed, and Muhammad made himself a reputation as being a wise young man. Muhammad made his living as a merchant. He began early on working for a woman whose name is Khadija. She was a widow, but a very successful merchant. And he would help supervise caravans. He would organize logistics for goods that should be taken on various caravans. And eventually, he became so well-liked and so popular and so successful, and that he became respected by everyone, and especially by Khadija. And eventually, he and Khadija married, and they lived happily through the rest of their lives. It was a very fruitful and happy relationship. Muhammad, in addition to being successful in his merchant activities, was a very contemplative and sincere and religious young man. He would often retire to caves surrounding the city, and there he would pray and seek knowledge from God as best he could. One year, when he retreated to these caves, a marvelous vision came to Muhammad. Let's take a look at this video and we can understand what happened to him.
In a cave above Mecca, Muhammad had an experience that would be the defining moment of his life. An angel was said to appear before him in the form of a man, instructing him to recite in the name of God, the Almighty. For Muhammad, it was an encounter as profound as it was deeply disturbing.
And that is the beginning of the prophetic career of Muhammad.
The months to come would bring more revelations. Powerful words of a lyrical quality, more beautiful than the most exquisite Arabic poetry.
Yes, Muhammad was called as a prophet. An angel, the angel Gabriel, came to visit with him, and he recited to him the exact words of God. Those words were later written down upon Muhammad's dictation. Muhammad could neither read nor write, but they were eventually written down, and those words, the words of God through the angel and through Muhammad, became known as the Quran. The Quran is written in Arabic, and it is holy, that is, it is the words of God only in Arabic. There are, of course, translations, but they do not have the same weight as being a holy book as does the original Arabic. The word Quran means simply a reading or a recitation. There is no plot to the Quran. It is 114 sections called surahs, and each of those sections is self-contained. It talks about doctrine, social behavior, afterlife, many other subjects. It is, for the LDS person, very similar to the concept or the form of the Doctrine and Covenants. So it's a series of sections, each one dealing with a different subject. Here we can see a discussion of the Islamic beliefs in this short video.
Muhammad's following began to grow. They called themselves Muslims, for those who surrender to God. They set out to preserve the message Muhammad had brought. This was the beginning of the Quran.
And from a very early date, and it's very unclear when that date was, because no early manuscripts of the Quran survive, people began copying it down.
The Quran is a revelation of spiritual teaching, of both ethical and social guidance. It was revealed and remains in Arabic. With words alone, the Quran delivers its vision to the faithful. Its imagery conjures a picture of the afterlife that resonates with all the power of traditional Bedouin poetry.
Imagine yourself in the desert, surrounded by dust, by the glare of the sun. You wear cloaks to cover your body because the wind will just sear your skin right off your face. And you walk into an oasis. The temperature drops dramatically. There's a quiet there. The wind is no longer howling. Everywhere you look, you see green and color. The world of water and paradise are symbolically tied to one another. And the Quran can conjure that up with just a few briefly chosen words.
Yet for all the imagery of paradise in the Quran, there was no easy description of God. The mystery would remain.
Now, a little more about Muhammad's history. After the angel gave him parts of the Quran, and that happened over a fairly extended period of time, he began to preach what the angel told him. Some of those concepts were worship only one God and give up idols. That was very difficult for the people of Mecca because they had the Kaaba, and the Kaaba at that time was a place that they believed idol worship should be conducted. And the people of Mecca were great makers of idols, and therefore they were very reluctant to give up idol worship. Reminds me of the situation of Ephesus in the New Testament, where Paul went to preach, and the people of Ephesus were also idol makers, and they were reluctant to give that up, and they drove Paul from their midst. Muhammad also taught that other religions, specifically Christianity and Judaism, had departed from the truth. We might call it, not their word, but we would call it an apostasy. And therefore he was called to restore again the true religion of God as was given originally to Abraham. Muhammad, through these discussions, converted his wife, the first convert, and several others, close family members and those within his tribe and some other tribes as well. Most of the people of the city of Mecca were strongly opposed to this discussion, and they didn't worry at all about threatening Muhammad, and it appears that they would have killed him, except that he was protected by his uncle. Remember, his uncle was the head of Muhammad's tribe and, of course, a very influential person within the city of Mecca. But eventually his uncle died and Muhammad was forced to flee. The flight from Mecca to a city, not quite neighboring, it's a little ways away, but it was the nearest city to Mecca in those days, is called the Hijra or Hijra. And let's take a look at a short video that talks about this flight into this neighboring city.
They demanded that Muhammad's uncle remove his clan's protection from the Prophet, which would clear the way for his murder without the threat of retribution. But his uncle refused. The battle lines were drawn. Nothing short of tribal war would settle the conflict now. Muhammad's followers were forced from the marketplace and starved. Those without clan protection were tortured and killed. In 619 AD, Muhammad's wife Khadija died, and his uncle as well. Gone were his first great love and his only protector. Here at last was the opportunity his enemies had been waiting for. But in the lush oasis town of Yathrib, north of Mecca, a refuge opened to Muhammad and his people. Clan rivalries had become deadly in the town, and they desperately needed a peacemaker. Muhammad agreed to travel to Yathrib and settle their disputes in exchange for a safe refuge for his people. For Muhammad's followers, leaving the place of their ancestors, their families and tribes, was the ultimate test of devotion. In doing so, they began a new community, a new tribe. For the first time, they were bound together not by blood, but by faith. In the course of a single caravan journey, Islam marks its true beginnings. Their journey is known as the Hijrah.
The time of this flight is counted as year 1 in the Muslim calendar, and therefore the Muslim calendar and the Christian calendar are not in agreement. Not only are they not in agreement in their starting point, but the Christian calendar, of course, is based on a solar year, whereas a Muslim calendar is based on a lunar year, and there's a few days difference between those two. The city that Muhammad fled to was called Yathrib, and later it was renamed Medina, Medina meaning city of the prophet. It was the first Muslim community. Not only did Muhammad take his adherents with him, because they would have been killed back in Mecca, but he quickly gained great success. When he got to Yathrib, they had invited this man to come because he was so well known as a person who could solve problems, and Yathrib was in the midst of turmoil amongst its tribes. When Muhammad got there, he again, as he did back in the early days with the problem in the Kaaba, he solved the problem, united the tribes, and in so doing, they began to trust him and trust his word, and he made many, many converts. He built the first mosque, and that mosque, at least in part, still exists in the city of Medina. Medina is considered to be the second most religious site in all of Islam. Now, what is Islam? Let's be clear about the term. Islam means the religion. The word itself means surrender, or he who surrenders. And the surrender is to the will of Allah, Allah being God, and therefore Islam is those who surrender their will to Allah. A Muslim is simply a person who practices the Islamic religion. Now let's take a look at some of the discussion about Muhammad and the prayer and return to Mecca that he had initiated.
We carry out physical gestures of prayer in worship that unify our body and our mind and our soul, all at the same moment of bowing and touching our head to the ground toward that exact center. What could be a more powerful symbol of unity?
It's said that while he was in Medina, Muhammad received a revelation, instructing those in prayer to face in the direction of the Kaaba in Mecca. Though filled with pagan idols, it was still the shrine of Abraham, the first believer in the one true God. But even as the Muslims were praying toward Mecca, their enemies there were rallying in force. Their goal, to wipe out the Muslims.
Yes, Muhammad taught a new way of praying. It was with hands before the face. It is to receive the blessings of God, to try and receive that which God would give. Just as a word of interest, the Christian method of prayer with hands clasped together came from a medieval practice where Christians, on the time that they would be knighted, would go before their Lord and they would put their hands in front of them. The Lord would clasp their hands and hold them tight and maybe even hurt the person a little bit, but hold them. And this act of hands together being held was an act of devotion and fealty to the Lord. And therefore it's in prayer, a Christian is giving obedience and fealty to the Lord of heaven. So that's not at all a bad symbol, but the symbol of the Muslims to accept the generosity and blessings of God with two hands before the face is an equally interesting and I think valid method of praying. Muhammad also taught dietary laws. He said that Allah had forbidden the use of alcohol and had forbidden the eating of pork. Muhammad also taught modesty in dress. The veil is not part of the religion. What is part of the religion is modesty. The veil is a local custom, and that exists in several countries around the world, and it is their way of ensuring modesty, but Muhammad did not say that a woman had to wear a veil, although he did advise that she should cover her hair so as to be modest. In Medina, Muhammad heard rumors that the people of Mecca were assembling an army that would come and conquer him. They were still upset that Muhammad was gaining power. Perhaps they feared Muhammad because they knew that eventually Muhammad would want to return to Mecca. And so in the midst of this preparation for war, Muhammad decided that he would do a preemptive strike, and he took his followers and they invaded Mecca and conquered that city. Here's a video that talks about the way that Muhammad treated the people of Mecca after he had conquered them and how he went to the Kaaba and destroyed the idols that were there.
A big revenge. The men are usually killed. Women and children are sold into slavery. There's little pity for the loser in a tribal war. Of course, that's standard around the world.
But Muhammad had a surprise in store for the fallen city. But not all of Mecca escaped Muhammad's wrath. Flush with victory, his troops marched straight to the Kaaba. 7 times they circled the shrine, as those who had come to seek its protection appealed to their idols. But it was not the pagan people Muhammad had come to destroy. It was their gods. He raised his staff, and the tribal gods of his ancestors smashed into dust.
When Muhammad entered Mecca and entered the shrine and destroyed the idols in the shrine, this is of great cultural and symbolic importance in Islam. By breaking the idols, he was breaking apart the tribal system in which each tribe really had its own independent deity.
The destruction of the idols was a new beginning, a breaking from the past and the creation of a powerful new force. Mecca was just the beginning. One after another, the tribes of a nation were summoned to the fold and united under the banner of Islam. A worldwide community of faith was begun, born in an extraordinary alignment of history, personality, and conviction.
Now Muhammad is in control of Mecca, he's in control of Medina, and he begins to expand, not initially by military power, initially just by the force of his personality and the strength of the doctrine that he taught. Later, it would be expanded militarily, but that was not the initial thrust. Now let's take a look at what are called the 5 pillars of Islam. These pillars are the 5 basic beliefs. And I think you'll find that Islam is a relatively simple religion based on these 5 pillars and only a few surrounding teachings and doctrines. Pillar number 1, belief in Allah and Muhammad as his prophet. All members of Islam, all Muslims, should give adherence to Allah, devotion to Allah, surrender to Allah, and they should proclaim that Muhammad was his prophet and therefore they believe in Muhammad's teachings. Number 2, pray 5 times a day. And these prayers are scattered from early morning to evening, and usually they are done in unison, and you can hear today loudspeakers calling people to pray, and anciently a person would go up into one of those tall minarets near the mosque and he would call people to pray. They did not necessarily go to the mosque. In fact, they rarely went to the mosque to pray except on their holy day, which was Friday. But they would try and pray 5 times a day. Next would be to pay alms of 2.5% of your income. And those are paid usually to a variety of Islamic charities. There is no single Islamic church as we think of it in Christian terms, but there are beliefs, but none of them is a system where there would be a strong clergy that would control an organization. So Islam is mostly free of organizations, not totally, but quite free of organizations. So when a person would pay these alms, they would pay directly to some charitable organization. 4th would be fasting. Fasting is done during 1 month a year. It is the month of Ramadan. And the Islamic fast is a unique fast, I think. They fast from daylight, sunup to sunset. And so during the daylight hours, there is no partaking of food or water. Before sunup, they can eat, and after sundown, they can eat. They do that for the entire month of Ramadan, and so that begins with the first light of the full moon and ends with the end of the moon cycle. Traditionally, interestingly enough, the breaking of the fast is done with some ceremony, the taking of a date, and then there is a holiday at the end of Ramadan, and this holiday is a great time of Thanksgiving, the family getting together and enjoying each other's company, and they usually have a sacrificial animal at that time, a sheep or a goat, and that's also part of the celebration of Ramadan. And finally, the 5th pillar is what is called the Hajj. The Hajj is a trip to Mecca, and the Muslim is asked to go to Mecca once in their lifetime. When they go to Mecca, they dress in white and they pray at the central mosque, at the Grand Mosque. They also, on other days, go into the desert, and there they perform certain duties. They throw stones at pillars that are supposed to represent Satan. They cast Satan out of their midst. They make covenants of loyalty and honesty. And in essence, it is a renewal of their life as a Muslim. From the time of the Hajj on, they are honored with the title in their name of Hajj, indicating that they have been on that trip. Sometimes a person is able to go on the trip more than once. When they do that, it is customary for that person to take the name of another person with them who will not be able to go on a Hajj during their life. Therefore, it is not at all unusual for a person to go on Hajj in proxy for someone else. I think it's very interesting. There are obviously some connections to the Hajj and what LDS belief is in some portions of the temple. Well, Muhammad died a few years after returning to Mecca. Let's take a look at what he did, or what happened after the death of Muhammad in this video.
In the 11th year of the Islamic calendar, 632 AD, only 2 years after the taking of Mecca, Muhammad died. Medina fell into despair. For days, the city was consumed with sorrow and ceremony.
He's known to have said that he wanted to be buried very simply, with no marker over his grave. He didn't want people to worship his grave. That would interfere with their worship of God.
God had spoken to them only through Muhammad. Now that the Prophet had left them, perhaps God would as well.
Muhammad's death set up a crisis in the young Islamic community. The question of succession was the first thing that really occupied people's concerns. At this point, there was a divergence of opinion as to how the community should go about choosing a new leader. According to the Shiites, the faction, the Shia of Ali, Muhammad had indeed designated Ali, his son-in-law and cousin, as his successor. The opinion that came to be the majority opinion, or the Sunni opinion, held that Muhammad had not appointed a successor during his life, but had said, after I am gone, choose one from among your peers, from among the elders.
Islam was devastated by the death of Muhammad, and there was a question about who should succeed. There were two camps. On one side, they insisted that the successor to Muhammad should be a relative. On the other side, they insisted that the successor to Muhammad should be the best person from among the community, probably chosen from amongst the elders. And this separation has persisted in Islam since that time. It is the separation between the Shiites and the Sunnis. The Shiites believed that it should have been a relative, and they said that that relative should be a man named Ali. Ali was Muhammad's nephew and son-in-law. And then on the other side, the Sunnis believed that the person who headed Islam should be the most capable, and they decided that it should be the leader of one of their tribes. The Sunnis became the most powerful of the groups, and therefore their choice prevailed. After the Sunnis took over control, there were 4 good caliphs. Caliph means the leading person in Islam, the both political and religious leader of Islam. There were 4 great caliphs at the beginning. Their names were Abu Bakr. He was elected by Muhammad's followers, but was disputed by the Shiites, as we've already said. Secondly, Umar, a good military leader who expanded Islam militarily. Uthman, who was elected by the people and was highly respected. And then the 4th was Ali. Yes, Muhammad's cousin, I said nephew, I meant cousin, and son-in-law. Ali should have been the person to unite the two, but he was assassinated and therefore could not be the one to unite the two groups. I think that it's an interesting point to compare the Sunnis and Shiites to Catholics, Protestants. There is a very close tie here. The Sunnis believe that there should be almost no central authority at all, very much like Protestants, whereas the Shiites tend to have charismatic leaders. For instance, you think of the Ayatollah in Iran. He was a Shiite leader, and so the Shiites are more focused on an individual who might be a very powerful leader, much like the Catholics are focused on a pope, whereas the Protestants or the Sunnis believe that there should be almost no organization and that salvation comes almost entirely from what a particular person would do in their own life. So here we see a map, and in that map it shows the areas of strength of the Shiites. If you notice that they are headquartered principally in the country of Iran. About 89% of those who live in Iran are Shiites, and only in the far eastern part of Iran, over close to Afghanistan and Pakistan, do we see the Sunnis having any presence at all. Then there is Iraq, where there's a large Shiite population, Lebanon, that has a reasonably large Shiite population, and the arc continues all the way down into the Gulf area, where Bahrain would have a large Shiite population. Here's a video that talks about how Islam was advanced under this next group of people to take over power in Islam, and they expanded it very quickly and very far.
The Muslims turned to the north, swept into present-day Lebanon and Syria. They continued west into Egypt and quickly across North Africa, fortifying the coastline of the Mediterranean. Only the seas stopped them.
Within 200 years, it extended from Spain to China.
The Muslims absorbed the Sasanian Empire of Iran and 2/3 of the Christian Byzantine Empire. By now, the empire was larger than Rome. It stretched from Morocco in the west to the Indus River in the east, where the border of India is today. How had it happened that so small an army could conquer an area so large, so fast, so easily?
The idea that Muslims were going across the world saying convert or die is really not accurate, not at all. That it didn't have a heavy hand. They didn't rule with a heavy hand. They allowed the conquered peoples to maintain their administrative structures.
It's the times that creates the movement, and sometimes the men. The Roman Empire had collapsed, the Byzantine Empire wasn't strong enough.
The lessons of the Quran, so successful for the Muslims in Medina and Mecca, were playing out on a global scale.
I think it's appropriate now to talk about a word. And that word is jihad. What does jihad mean? How did it apply anciently? And how does it apply in our present world? Well, the word jihad actually means suffering or struggle. There is a personal way of having a jihad. That personal struggle is the struggle against evil, the struggle against Satan and his power. It is a repentance. It is a struggle to surrender to God's will, to Allah's will. So principally, the word jihad means this individual struggle that is true for all people of Islam. There is also meaning of jihad that is a defense against the faith, or a defense of the faith against those who would attack it. But in this sense, the people of Islam must unite together in defense of the faith. The defense of the faith must not kill innocents and must not be associated with suicide. Therefore, the present tactics of terrorists who are suicide bombers, and they go out and proclaim that they are doing jihad, is just simply wrong. People in Islam see many of these suicide bombers as fanatics. They abhor the image that is being given to them by the suicide bombers. And they also say that whatever the suicide bomber is doing is an offense to Allah, because they are proclaiming that it's jihad, and it most certainly is not jihad. I will say this, however, that in modern countries, there are so many feelings against the things that are happening in the Middle East, against Islam, that in these countries, although they don't agree with the suicide bombers, neither do they condemn them openly, because to condemn them would mean that they are supporting the thing that the suicide bomber is trying to destroy. In some cases, that would be the country of Israel. In other cases, it would be American or Israeli foreign policy. Whatever it happens to be, the people of Islam today are reluctant to condemn what is being fought against, but on the other hand, they are not willing to support the fanatical people who go out and proclaim jihad in this false way. So there is a real dilemma in Islam today over the issue of suicide bombers. Now let's talk about the interaction of Muslims with Christians and Jews. In the Quran, it talks extensively about the great prophets of the past, the Old Testament prophets, Abraham, Noah, Moses, Adam. And in Islam, they consider Christ to be a great prophet. They therefore believe that those who follow the prophets of the Old Testament, that is Jews, and those who follow the prophet in their word of the New Testament, Christ, are people of the book, people who should be respected. They may not have all of the truth as Islam believes it has, but they do believe that they should be afforded special privileges, raised higher in estimation than, say, idolaters. And therefore, there is potentially a good feeling between those of Islam and those of both Christianity and Judaism. It's interesting to hear a person of Islam speak about the prophets of the old. When you talk to a Muslim and they mention the word Muhammad, they almost always say something like Muhammad, and then they give a phrase that say, may his name be blessed, or Muhammad, who is a wonderful person, or some phrase that goes along to indicate respect for Muhammad. Likewise, when they mention Jesus, or when they mention Moses or Abraham, they give a similar phrase. And so this shows great respect toward those prophets of the old who preceded Muhammad as being prophets of God. They do believe, of course, that ultimately those Christians and Jews who up to this time have refused to accept Muhammad as the prophet of God will come to the realization that Muhammad is the prophet. From an LDS point of view, the First Presidency has indicated that Muhammad did much great good. But, of course, in the LDS faith, there is a belief of another prophet, later prophet. In fact, several later prophets who began with Joseph Smith and continued to the present day. But the similarities with some of the Islamic beliefs, like a falling away of the church and a restoration of the truth, are strangely similar to those of LDS belief. It's important to understand the kind of feeling that Muhammad had toward knowledge and learning. Muhammad said, "Seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. Verily, the men of knowledge are the inheritors of the prophets." Other practices in Islam are rituals that they practice, usually on Friday before going to prayer. For instance, there is a ritual washing in Islam where they clean themselves before entering the mosque, especially on Friday, but they must clean themselves before every prayer. But it's done ritually on Friday. Prayer is simple, usually 5 to 10 minutes, and that prayer almost always recites the glories of God. It's usually a fixed prayer. Friday at noon in the mosque, there is a sermon that is given by a local leader chosen by the community. In that worship on Friday, the men kneel at the front of the mosque, and the women stand at the back of the mosque. So there is a men-women separation inside the mosque. Dress, of course, is always modest, and when women go to the mosque, they almost always cover their heads, but it is not totally true. You could go to a mosque uncovered, but you would cover inside the mosque. Now let's talk about the political divisions and the groups, the dynasties, if you wish, that have ruled Islam. I mentioned that after the first 4 great good caliphs, then the center of the religion moved outside of Saudi Arabia to Damascus, Syria. It was done under a group of men who were called the Umayyads, and they were tremendous warriors. They took the expansion that had already begun and they just expanded it tremendously. It grew throughout all of the Middle East, throughout North Africa, even throughout Spain, and they were only repelled in the early 700s by some of the French combatants, or they would have gone into Europe much more extensively than they had. The Umayyad dynasty then was centered in Damascus. Most of the territory that they gained was at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. They continued to rule Spain even to the end of the Spanish period under Islam. That period ended in 1492, the very same year that Columbus came to America. Spain became separated from the rest of Islam after the fall of the Umayyad dynasty. They practiced a caliphate. They were in charge of Islam, but they were not related in any way to Muhammad. And these people were almost all Sunnis. The next great dynasty was called the Abbasid or Abbasid dynasty. They moved the headquarters of Islam to Baghdad in present-day Iraq. They also had a caliphate, and in their case, they did claim to be related to Muhammad. There was little interest in conquering additional territories. What conquering went on was more political than religious, and they even signed an agreement with the Byzantine emperor to kind of freeze things where they were without any necessary attempt at expansion. The time of the Abbasid dynasty was the cultural high point of Islam. You've probably heard of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, or Scheherazade, or some of the great stories that come out of the Middle East. They would have occurred during this period of time. Most of these Abbasids were Sunnis, but they were also supported by the Shiites. It was perhaps the gathering together of the two groups that helped bring a flowering of Islam during this period. Other groups that had tremendous power within the Islamic groups were in the 900s, a dynasty called the Fatimids. They were headquartered in Cairo, and at this time we see a bit of a separation between the Abbasids in Baghdad and the Fatimids in Cairo. Theoretically, the Fatimids were under the domination of the Abbasids, but that domination was weak, and so the Fatimids more or less did what they wanted to do. They were, by the way, Shiites. Then, a little later, the Seljuk Turks came into power, and they were a bit like renegades. They decided to do some things that were abhorrent to the rest of Islam. One of the things that they did is they cut off access for Christians to go into the Holy Land, into Jerusalem in particular, and they burned the most holy site in Jerusalem for the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox religions. That holy site was the great Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, the church was rebuilt shortly thereafter by others outside of the Seljuk Turks, but the damage had been done, and that was one of the things that led directly to the Crusades. Eventually, the Seljuk Turks were defeated by the Crusaders, who took over Jerusalem and many of the coastal areas of the Middle East. But then another dynasty came in, and they were Kurdish. They were headed by a tremendous military leader named Saladin. And Saladin was able to rally the Muslims against the Crusaders, and just a mere 100 years after the Crusaders' first invasion, they were essentially driven out of the Holy Land by Saladin and his troops. He was, in turn, defeated by the Mongols, who came in the 1300s, late 1300s, and they actually conquered and destroyed the city of Baghdad. Later, the Ottomans, another Turkish group, came into power, and they began to dominate the entire Islamic Middle East. They conquered most of North Africa, most of what we call the Middle East today, and they conquered Turkey and to the east. And as we've already discussed, in 1453, these Ottoman Turks destroyed the defenses of Constantinople and took over that city. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the art, culture, architecture, and some of the great accomplishments of Islam during this very long period. One of the interesting parts of Islam, and something that I came to love when I was in high school, were the writings of a Persian astronomer named Omar Khayyam. He was during the Abbasid period when Islam was in its flower. Let me just recite a couple of short poems that were written by Omar Khayyam from his book called The Rubaiyat. He said, "Come, fill the cup, and in the fire of spring the winter garment of repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way to fly, and lo, the bird is on the wing." Yes, it's an interesting comment comparing the seasons with our personal attempts at repentance and the need to move along quickly and repent in your life. Here's one that perhaps you have heard. It's quite famous. "Here with a loaf of bread beneath the bough, a flask of wine, a book of verse, and thou beside me, singing in the wilderness, and wilderness is paradise now." Yes, there was love poems back in the days of Islam as well. One of the most interesting architectural feats of Islam is the construction of what is called the Dome of the Rock. It is a beautiful, beautiful building in Jerusalem. It is in the area that the Jews call Temple Mount, and that Islam refers to as the holy place or the special place. It is covered by gold, shimmers in the light of Jerusalem. The building itself is built over a large rock, and that rock was, according to Islam, the rock where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son, and also a rock from which Muhammad's horse ascended into heaven during a night vision that Muhammad had of paradise. And so this rock is very, very sacred to those of Islam. And because of it, Jerusalem is the third sacred city of Islam. Let's take a look at this short video that talks about the Dome of the Rock.
It was built to rival the nearby Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus was said to have been buried.
What's extraordinary about the Dome of the Rock is how perfect it is. People revered this site as some place that was holy to Abraham and to Isaac. Imagine, if you will, these new guys coming in and taking over this piece of prime real estate and building a new building for a new religion that sits on top of a mountain and sparkles and glitters in the sunlight for everyone to see. This is not something that a fly-by-night. This is something big and important. Islam has come to stay.
When I first went to Spain, my wife and I went together and we decided that we would prepare ourselves for this visit to Spain by reading several books about Spain. One would be Michener's book called Iberia. Another would be a book written by Washington Irving. This book was called Tales of the Alhambra. It's a marvelous book written by Washington Irving, the American author who wrote Rip Van Winkle and Legend of Sleepy Hollow. When Washington Irving went to Spain, and this would be in the latter part of the 1700s, as I remember, he was sent around the country, and he was given the opportunity to actually live in the last palace of the Muslims prior to their being kicked out of Spain in 1492 by the Catholic king and queen Ferdinand and Isabella. So here is this palace of the Muslims called the Alhambra, and Washington Irving is in the palace, and he decides to write the stories that are being told to him by the people who work and live in the palace and in its vicinity. Those stories have been collected into Tales of the Alhambra. I recommend it. It is a marvelous book to read before you see the Alhambra, and it talks about the tremendous stories that have come down through the ages from this Islamic kingdom that existed in Spain prior to 1492. When my wife and I finally went to the Alhambra, she said to me, "This is the most romantic place I have ever seen." So it is lovely. Let's take a look at not only these pictures that you've been looking at, but a short video on the Alhambra.
In the green hills above Granada was a palace of startling elegance, a shining example of the richness and sophistication Islam brought to medieval Europe. It is called the Alhambra.
The Alhambra is perhaps the most famous example of Islamic architecture to most Westerners. It is the best remaining example of what a medieval Muslim palace would have looked like.
Echoed in the finely carved geometric plasterwork and marble pillars is a vanished lifestyle of extraordinary luxury. The Alhambra reveals the pinnacle of Islamic culture and urbanity.
The beauty of the Alhambra is not so much in the individual details. No, it's more the combination of everything. That is, this wonderful sort of orchestrated interplay of different textures and surfaces, of light and space and water playing inside and outside of buildings. It's almost like a symphony of different elements that are very carefully brought together to provide exquisite enjoyment.
Here, the Muslim elite relished the good life. Reposing on lush carpets, surrounded by perfume and music, the privileged few debated the nature of God, the subtleties of Greek philosophy, or the most recent mathematical revelations from India, while they dined on spiced delicacies served on Chinese porcelains. They strolled the grounds through gardens irrigated by complex gravity-fed water systems. How far Muhammad's followers had come from the life of desert nomads. How distant they felt from the rest of the European continent they now shared. Christian Europe, due north, was struggling on through the Dark Ages.
I think now that it's important that we should have a brief discussion about the interrelationship between Islam and LDS faith. The First Presidency, as I've already mentioned, has said that Muhammad had a portion of the truth, and they have already indicated that he raised the level of spirituality among the Arab people. He was certainly a good influence and probably was inspired by God. In fact, the First Presidency said that he, along with other religious leaders like Martin Luther, were inspired men. But there were some things that Muhammad did not understand, at least from the LDS point of view. He did not understand the divine nature of Christ's person. He did not understand the resurrection. He did not understand the need for additional prophets. How could that be? Is it because he received the wrong words? Is it because he misunderstood what the angel said? Is it because he didn't go far enough? We're not sure. But to help us with our thinking, at least, we should understand that there is not only a great book, the Quran, that is the exact words of God, but there is also another book, or at least another group of teachings. They're called the Hadith. The Hadith is the teachings of Muhammad as he was inspired, but not as he was directed by the angel to recite the words of God. Therefore, the Hadith has a lower order of importance in comparison to the Quran. It is in the Hadith that many of these practices and beliefs arise, and therefore it could be argued that the Hadith has been changed, that the doctrine has been changed from what God wanted Muhammad to have, perhaps changed by successors. And there are certain differences in copies of the Hadith today among various Islamic groups. And so clearly there has been a choice of doctrine in some detail, although perhaps the fundamentals are quite similar. It's also possible that Muhammad did not have all the doctrine. Perhaps the people of Arabia were unwilling to accept the full doctrine. My thoughts go to Moses. I remember that Moses went up onto the mountain and returned with a covenant for the people, and they refused it. Moses was very disappointed, and he went back to God, and God said, I'd like to start again. But Moses asked God to spare the people. God said he would, but he would give them a lower law, a less difficult covenant. And therefore Moses went back with the Levitical or Aaronic covenant. Well, perhaps something like that, and of course this is just speculation on my part, but something like that may have happened with Muhammad. Or God may have realized that the people of Arabia at this time were unwilling to accept the full gospel, and therefore they were given only part of the gospel, enough to raise them, enough to be better, enough to lead them ultimately to the real truth, the whole truth. But initially, only part of the truth came to them. I don't know, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Perhaps they were given just a school teacher for the full gospel. So now I think we need to bring it to the modern day. With such a rich heritage, why aren't Muslims playing a major role in culture today in the world? I think there are several cases that we should consider. Case one, they are playing a major role, and we're just not aware of it. With our European orientation, we tend to dismiss people who are non-Europeans. We see very little value in culture outside of culture originating from Europe. It's a very parochial point of view. That got people into trouble when Japan had such great success during the early part of the 1900s. And it also gets people in China very angry because they look at their own culture and think of how great it is. So perhaps the Arabs or Muslims are doing much more in the world than we realize. That's one point of view. Another, for many, many years, the Arabs were dominated by the Turks. And the Turks were cruel taskmasters for much of that time. This was the time from 1453, or perhaps a little bit before, all the way through the end of World War I. And during that period, we see that the Turkish domination was ruthless and sometimes very closed-minded. The Turks believed that they were the keepers of the truth, and all knowledge would be given to them by God, and therefore they were the ones who should lead. Well, by having that attitude, they didn't accept innovations that were being made in Europe, innovations such as the scientific awakening, the Industrial Revolution, and the Enlightenment. Because of that, the Arab peoples were always dominated by leaders who would not let them understand these new innovations that came through Europe, and therefore they simply were dominated and missed out on all of those innovations. Another concept could be that Muslims simply have different values, that they are doing what they want to do, and what they want to do is different from what Europeans believe that they should do. And then I mention as my fourth case, the Muslims missing out on the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution. Previously it was because they were dominated by the Turks. Now we see that that domination may have resulted in a loss of Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution. Before moving on, I'd like to comment on something that's happening right now. I'm sitting here in 2011. I don't know what year it is that you're seeing this, but let me tell you what's happening in this very day. There are revolutions that are going on in most of the Arabic countries of the Middle East. Started in Tunisia, moved to Egypt. There are revolutions in many, many others, such as Libya, even some disruptions in countries that seemingly are at peace, like Jordan. There are problems in Iran. I believe that all of these problems are based in a people seeking freedom. They are seeking freedom because they know now what Europeans learned in the 16 and 1700s. They know now through all of these mass communication methods that freedom is an inherent right, God-given, and that all people should have the right to freedom. It is the internet, it is modern technology that has given them the understanding that was denied by the domination under foreign rulers that they had for so many years. I don't know what's going to happen, but I have great confidence that ultimately these people will see a freedom that they've never had before. And Islam and Christianity and Judaism will, because of that shared freedom, draw closer together. I am tremendously optimistic, and I have tremendous respect for Islam. And I think that you can see that it has been and may yet be a tremendous force for good in the world. Thank you.